Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Miriam Nyhan Gray, and I'm really privileged to be here this morning. And I just want to say to you, Mr. McGowan, often in these kind of places, we can be very lofty in our approach, with no disrespect to either Roland or Ida, because they were absolutely amazing interventions and so complimentary. But I think starting today with the absolutely arresting and grounding reality of what today is about is really, really important. And we've a really wonderful panel here today, but I just want to acknowledge how the day has opened, because I think it's really set the tone. I'm very intimidated with the panel. I'm tasked with chairing this morning three experts in the best use of that word in various aspects of what we're discussing today. And I'll go straight into introducing Professor Orla Muldoon, and she is the founding professor of psychology at the Department of Psychology, and she is the director of the Centre for Social Issues Research at the University of Limerick. She has published more than 120 peer-reviewed papers and many book chapters, all of which speak to the influence of power and privilege, reified through social identities on the development of health, well-being, and social and political participation. She served as a member of the Behaviour and Communication Subcommittee reporting to NEFIT, and is a current board member of the Irish Research Council. She is Editor-in-Chief of Political Psychology, and the Royal Irish Academy elected her as a member last year in 2022. Today, Orla's talk is entitled Different Boats in the Same Storm, Work and Play During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Please welcome Orla Muldoon. Thanks, Orla. Nice to meet you.
An ambitious height for me. In my head, I'm 5'11". Sadly, not a reality. So I'll maybe start just by saying that when you say you're a psychologist to people generally, they say things like, I don't feel very well, I had a cousin who had depression, or that's how they see psychology. I'm a social psychologist, which means I'm interested in normal behaviour. And I'm particularly interested in how context influences behaviour. So I'm very hopeful that I will convince Roland that there was a voice saying during the pandemic that we need to pay attention to relational concerns, and that we weren't all people who were interested in an individualised model of behaviour. So I guess the other thing I would say, and very interested in what the first panel had to say on the issue of stress and trauma and adversity. My core area of interest is in how adversity impacts people. So when the pandemic came along, an awful lot of what we were dealing with was stressed people. And the idea that you would be left with a hangover from some of the experiences is certainly something that I would strongly agree with, and I think is represented already in the conversations this morning. I think many of us have been left with a very unwanted hangover from the pandemic. And then by way of apology, a little bit data heavy. So yeah, that's just the nature of social science. Sorry. Okay, so we've already had somebody say that they couldn't believe how it was when the pandemic came along that everybody did what they were told, that 70-year-olds just sat down and did what they were told. Being the daughter of he was almost 80 at that stage, it was very unusual to see my father sit down and do what he was told. I think it was the first time he had done it in his life. So one of the things that we know happens is that when people are threatened, they are more likely to comply. So threat leads to compliance. But we also know that this can have a very negative representation. You can end up with a kind of an authoritarian way of being. And I represent it here in a statistical model, and we showed evidence of this in 3 studies in Ireland, the UK and the US, but we also got involved in an international study that shows that this was a really strong effect during the pandemic. That actually the wagons circle and people just insist that we all do what we're told. But the other thing that threat does is it drives up our adherence and our inclination to attach to groups. And we saw that in the pandemic. We saw governments using national identity, for example. We saw things like Operation Connacht, the rhetorical use of national language to get people to do what it was government wanted. As somebody has already said, we see the media playing the game, trying to get everybody to roll. So this can have a really good consequence. We can show that this means that people adhere more to the restrictions. The downside is that you get people who actually don't feel that they are Irish in the way that maybe other people are Irish. So I would say I'm a fully paid up member of the Irish community. But often I'm an Irish mammy, and sometimes I'm an Irish daughter. And when those things bump into somebody telling me that it is very important that we have off licenses as essential services, but not children's footwear as essential services, I begin to say, hold on a minute, whose Ireland is this? And this speaks profoundly to issues of trust and compliance and adherence. But one of the problems in this country, as in many countries, is that we actually have quite a small country. So people, when you raise the issue, can take things quite personally. They can feel that you're pointing out that they did wrong. Or if people don't comply, they can feel as if they personally are got at. So I think it's really important in these conversations that everybody is aware that we're talking about the issues. We're not trying to get at anyone. We're trying to get at the idea that we can learn, we can be reflective, we can think about when this happens again, rather than when this happens again, that we do this in a way that I suppose keeps everybody on board, rather than making people feel as if they're outside the national group. So when we think of the pandemic, it caused threat in the beginning, and we can all remember those days when we're looking at Lombardy. But of course, our pandemic was long. It didn't just happen in a 5-day window where we all felt threatened. Actually, the pandemic ran, and there is a huge amount of data that was collected by the Department of Health over that time to look at how people felt. And one of the things that we can see very quickly is that there are specific groups of people whose adherence to the public health regulations begin to fall away. They're not just as convinced. And a key group, but we could take many different groups. We could take migrant groups, we could take the diaspora, we could take older people or younger people, we could take women. But what you find, particularly when we think about younger people, is that you see their compliance falling away quite quickly. And of course, younger people were the people who mostly were out working in shops, were running our health service. They tended not to be in managerial roles, so therefore were very much at the coalface in many cases. So on the one hand, we were telling them to go on the Lewis, to take public transport, to be in a retail place, and we were asking them to do all of this face-to-face activity when they went to work. But on the other hand, we were telling them that they couldn't, for instance, gather and eat together. So one of the things that we find, if we look at, and it's again back to this idea of authoritarianism, when we look at the fixed penalty notices, what we see is that the proportion of people who get fixed penalty notices, who are aged between 18 and 25, is about 53% of all fixed penalty notices. But if you think about someone, as in fact we did interview someone, who lived in a co-living space who was issued with the fixed penalty notice, he went to the shared area where they ate, and there was 7 of them. And another person in the 17-person house complained that that was a I suppose, a gathering. And they were all issued with fixed penalty notices. So we have this authoritarian thing going on where actually people want action if there's gatherings, but at the same time, we want people to staff. So from the point of view of the person in the co-living house, this does not make sense. So if we're talking about trust and getting people to adhere, this is an excellent example of how we were asking people to do particular things during the day, and then in the evening, asking them to do something completely different, and then punishing them for the fact that they lived in a house where they had a shared kitchen. And that is the kind of thing that completely undermines trust. So the likelihood of people being willing to comply when they feel that the rules don't work for them is actually quite low. So when we think about whether or not people will do anything, and I think, for any of us that are parents, this is a key one. When you're trying to get a child to do something, when will they do something? Well, first of all, they have to be able. They have to have the capacity. So had people the capacity to do certain actions? One of the things that we frequently saw early on in the pandemic was advice to people, if somebody came home with COVID, to put them in the ensuite room. That speaks to a middle-class audience. If you live in a place where there is a shared bathroom, there's absolutely no way that moving the person into the ensuite room makes any sense. So, and equally, I had a colleague who had 4 young children, and she was being told to move X into the ensuite. But as parents, they both had COVID, and one by one, the children got COVID, and she was supposed to isolate the 12-year-old and the 10-year-old and the 8-year-old, which she tried to do. But it was the night the TV fell on the floor that she decided that they couldn't all be isolated in the ensuite together anymore, because she really had no idea what was going on. And the youngest child was outside crying to get in to where the crack was with the other 3. So there's all sorts of things. The kinds of groups who are really trying hard to engage with the rules, if the rules don't make sense, they actually end up pushing the rules away. And I think that we really need to think about how the rules were based on an individual model. So were we able? Well, all of what we know says that lives are relational and people's lives are relational. And that model of individualism doesn't pay off. And I guess the other thing that we had going on a lot in NFET was people talking about, well, if only people understood, it was knowledge was the deficit. It only takes you 30 seconds on Twitter to realise that we had a whole body of experts who had appeared on all sorts of things. People who all of a sudden appeared to understand lots of things quite well. And lots of people talking in an educated way. So if it was a knowledge deficit, it wasn't clear. Most people understood what was being asked of them. It was just that they couldn't necessarily do it. So there was an ability thing. But equally, sometimes there was a willingness thing, because the rules didn't work to the relational aspects of people's lives. That idea that we are not autonomous, independent agents, we're actually acting from a place of social self. So one of the things, I suppose, that I found most frustrating during the pandemic was the move to this idea of personal responsibility. So the idea of personal responsibility is really built heavily on the notion that we are individual actors and that we aren't influenced by things that happen around us. So we had in the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm sure many of you remember this graph, where it was talked about, the need to flatten the curve so that our health service could manage. So therefore, the idea was that we were all in it together, that we would work together to flatten the curve. We being all of us, the entire nation, or indeed more correctly, probably the entire world. So the idea that somehow that if we were in it together, that we would be able to flatten the curve and our health system would cope, and that when people needed healthcare, that healthcare would become available. And of course, that idea works with the idea and the science of transmission. My risk is linked to whether or not you have COVID. I cannot prevent myself from catching COVID from myself. I can prevent myself from catching COVID from someone else. So the idea of personal responsibility defies the idea that this is something that is passed through people, and factors like density of housing really matter, or en suites really matter. We also know that this messaging is much stronger when we do the we idea. So when we say that it is something that we all need to do. Because if we say it's something that I need to do, well, then there might be an occasion where what I need to do, there's something else that's more important. So I might think that it's very important that I wash my hands. But if I have a 4-year-old who's screaming at me about something else, I might just attend to them before I wash my hands. So actually the we-ness and emphasizing the relational element of protecting the 4-year-old and the need to wash the hands irrespective of the scream is important. I suppose the really big one that I found really undermining was the idea that if it is all about personal responsibility, well then what we were saying was that evidence and the evidence base in terms of public and social policy wasn't important. If it's about all of us being in it together, well, then we must shape public policy. If it's only about personal responsibility, well, then your opinion of whether or not it's right or wrong to do something is relevant. And I really think that we should have been driven by available scientific information. And I understand there was disagreements, and I understand that often there was a need to change. But if we move towards personal responsibility, we move to a position where people's opinions on the science matter. And really people's opinions on the science shouldn't matter. What should matter is the science and how that drives public policy. I suppose the other big issue for me, and I think it's come up already this morning, and it's where I want to talk for the last few minutes that I have afforded to me, 5 minutes afforded to me, is the idea that if we take it that we're in it together and we're somehow trying to respond collectively, well, then there is a need for coherent and consistent responding, and trust becomes important. And I think we've already had a lot of talk about trust. And this is, I suppose, one of my favourite recollections. And it tells you more about me, I suppose, than anything else. But it's one of my favourite recollections of the pandemic was where the executive committee of University of Limerick, after an awful lot of negative publicity about student behaviour, decided they would patrol the streets at night to keep the students from having parties. So it was after there had been a coverage on I think it was on the national radio about student party behaviour. But I really love the idea of the president and the deans and the vice presidents out in their high-vis vests, walking up and down looking for students who are drinking beer. Really, it's just, when you think about authoritarianism, it's just such a good representation of how authoritarian we became. Imagine there's a student drinking beer, the horror. But one of the things that we did at that time was we ran this experiment where we tried to look at whether if you changed the language and changed the representation of the people giving the message. And we have 3 lovely studies that we did where we changed from the 3 men at the podium, the multiple voices and students and different ethnicities and genders and accents. And if you change the voices and change the language to we all must do this rather than you must do this, to kind of remove the authoritarianism, we got these really nice, powerful effects showing that actually you could improve student compliance without the high-vis jackets, although where'd be the fun in that? And I guess the last thing I want to say as we move forward, because one of the reasons that we think that experimental idea worked was because, of course, the students were more inclined to trust those who were more like them than the 3 men at the podium, who they probably saw as urban and middle class and not really like them. So where I want to go next is that this isn't over. We still have things that we need to do. we subsequently, in trying to convince people of the power of trust, we tried to do, and we ended up doing a systematic review as the data became available. And what we showed was that actually, when you look at vaccine uptake, it isn't knowledge, it's trust, because most of us don't really understand how a vaccine is made. You know, we kind of get it, but, you know, even someone like me that knows a little bit about serology and, you know, we don't actually get what happened. We trust that the vaccine is good. So actually, what's really important in vaccine uptake is trust. And what you find is that it tends to be lower in groups like minority ethnic groups, low-income groups, and women, because these are the groups who've had bad experiences with pharmacy companies in the past or who've had bad experiences with vaccines. So we really need to attend to trust and social cohesion. And then going forward, and I think this to me is, I suppose this is probably the paper that we're most proud of, and we were very, very busy during the pandemic. Well, when I say we, I say I'm taking all credit, but it was obviously other people who were doing the dirty work. But this is probably the paper I'm most proud of. It looks at the idea that social cohesion and trust is important to your vaccine response. So it takes social science and it links it to biology using what is called the UK Understanding Society dataset, which is a huge big dataset of 12,000 people. And what you can show in this dataset is that where people have more trust in their neighbours, science, not politicians, but neighbours, science, healthcare workers, and where that trust is present, that they have stronger antibody response to the COVID-19 vaccine. And that is to the tune of about 35 to 40% stronger vaccine response. And we accept that placebo effects are real. We accept that these things are real, but somehow we think that there is an individual model of medicine at work here. And there just isn't. All of the evidence tells us that actually things like how integrated we are into our communities, how lonely we are, and how we feel about other people around us are really important. And that's a really, I suppose, the thing that I want people to take home, that we need to understand how our communities and our groups and our nation supports everybody, not just those who happen to have position of power or privilege.
Thank you so much, Orla. That was really a great start to this panel, and looking forward to picking up some questions and comments and observations after the next two panelists. So I'll now introduce Philip Nolan. He is Director General of Science Foundation Ireland, previously president of Maynooth University. He managed unprecedented growth and diversification of teaching and research and a doubling of the research capacity of the university. Philip earned his degrees in physiology and medicine at UCD and was awarded a PhD in physiology for his research on the control of breathing and the cardiovascular system during sleep. He was appointed director of the UCD Conway Institute for Biomolecular and Biomedical Research. You can tell I don't use these words that often, before becoming registrar and deputy president at UCD. During 2020 and 2021, Philip was centrally involved in the management of the COVID-19 pandemic as a member of the National Public Health Emergency Team, chairing its disease modelling subgroup. I'm really honoured to welcome Philip to if you're going to speak from there. Yeah, wherever you want to speak is perfect.
It's much more comfortable
Perfect.
here. So I've settled in after some really stimulating contributions so far. And I had prepared something to say, and I'm going to modify it slightly because I think it might help the conversation. I was very struck by things that have been said earlier. And I'll try and recount some of those. So let me start with Roland Stout's observation about trust in process and trust in people, and the core thing being trust in the scientific process. The only other person who asks me to trust the process is my therapist. And there's I'm making a material point. The conversation here is about aftermath. It's about, we're here appropriately discussing a very traumatic period and what we might be able to learn from it. And I actually don't want to instrumentalize that learning at all. So I'm here as a scientist and academic who is, as you say, centrally involved in the response. So to take Ida's, like the dramaturgy of this, I was an actor in the response. And I use that word in the social science sense rather than the dramatic sense, but it's used. And I think it's important that the starting point is then that we think about that as a human action. So this isn't about, I am going to talk about the process to see what we can learn from it, and I will stick to time. But I think the two starting words could be to think about it in human terms, and I think the second word that we might retain in our mind then is humility, whether it came across or not. And I want to come back to process on uncertainty. I always thoroughly disliked the mantra of follow the science. Not just because it came out in such an authoritarian and imperialist fashion, if I can be blunt about it. I also have a kind of an animus against the three-word public statement, or the collapsing of everything into words that can be put in front of a podium surrounded by that ambulance reflective material. So follow the science is always deeply problematic for a scientist, because there is no science. It's a contested system of coming to know. And of course, in the pandemic, we weren't engaged in the process of simply coming to know. We were engaged in the process of how could we support a society in making appropriate decisions in response to a novel threat. It wasn't an unprecedented threat, but it was a novel threat. And the second thing is I'm always, so that's number one. I think what I'm going to do is just give as much narrative as I can. So I think we're in the position now where I am the actor and you are the scholars and critics, if I can put it that way. And it might be worth replaying some of the narrative of it, because I do think the social sciences could have helped us more. And that's not a criticism of them, it's a criticism of the capacity to absorb that system of knowledge. The humanities did what the humanities were empowered to do, and that included a pivot. But I think now there's a real power to put the lens of the humanities and social sciences on the capacity to learn, actually the capacity to heal this trauma. If anybody's interested, years ago I was introduced by Anna Fuchs to the novels of W.J. Sebald. So one resort for me in the immediate aftermath is to go back to the literature of another great trauma, the post-war German literature of Sebald and Bohl. It's a safe space for me to say, how do societies and individuals experience trauma and actually process it. So I think the humanities and social sciences, there are great scientific things we can do, but the humanities and social science, that lens to say, how are we going to see our way through this trauma, and what do we have to learn about the processes which we worked through the pandemic? And then there was an interesting discussion on expertise and trusting the expert. And you did, in your introduction, talk about expert in the proper sense of the word. And I'm always curious as to what is the proper sense of that word? Where does it come from? And one of my favorite old proverbs is ars longa vita brevis, when you were a child looking at the movies and the lion would roar, and ars longa vita brevis, occasio praeseps experimentum periculosum judicium difficile. That's the full aphorism. And there are various translations of that, but like, what is it trying to say? It says, okay, the acquisition of a skill takes a very long time, ars longa. Life is short. That's the bit we know. Occasio praeceps, opportunity fleeting. Time is never on our side. Experimentum periculosum. Standard translation is experiments are dangerous. What it really means is the acquisition of experience is risky. So, and judicium difficile, judgment is difficult. And that's actually not a bad, even though it's very ancient, lens to look at the process. And experimentum is in that, frequently mistranslated as experiment. It really is the acquisition of knowledge. It comes from experere, the verb to try, and expertum, so is simply to have tried. So an expert is somebody who has tried and tried and tried to do something, form a craft, figure something out. So God loves a trier. And I think that's the human and humble origin of what is an expert. It's simply somebody who has systematically tried to address an issue. So then quickly remarks on some of the narrative. The encounter with the SARS coronavirus 2 was, I think, our first major encounter since the Spanish flu with our own vulnerability to respiratory viruses. So viruses evolve to spread. So a successful virus is a virus that spreads and embeds itself in a population. And it's evolved to exploit that very thing that holds us together, to exploit our sociability and our communality. So the more collective and the more intimate the contact, the more successful the virus is in spreading. And unfortunately, our kit, our capacity to respond to that is essentially medieval. Like, there are very few tools available to us, even in the 21st century, in the early stage of a novel outbreak, to prevent the spread of the thing, than simply to retreat into our homes. And I acknowledge Orla's point, like, our homes are socially constructed, literally, and very varied. And that's very difficult for us as a society to simply accept. We have to wait for a vaccine less time than we expected. And there's not a whole lot else we can do to prevent this. So I guess the real trauma of this is it exposes that despite all of our technological sophistication in the global north, we remain vulnerable to the emergence of these new threats. And look, I mean, the threat was real. We saw it in Lombardy. We'd be looking at kind of 25 to 35,000 deaths if the virus had simply been allowed to spread through an unvaccinated population. So flattening the curve never would have worked, it turns out. We had to flatten the curve until the vaccine arrived. So that's issue number one. And issue number two, I guess, in the interests of, so the threat was real. The reason that there aren't significant excess deaths are twofold. One, the effective suppression of the spread of the virus up until the point that the vaccines arrived. And the displacement, sadly, the displacement of some deaths which will occur so at a later date. So influenza, even things as trivial as road deaths, accidents, there's a whole lot of stuff that went down. Suicides perhaps did go up. So I think it's important as we go through the narrative to think about humanity, to think about what we learned about the necessarily contested nature of science. And I was deeply struck then by both Roland and Orla in the sense of this does need to be a collaborative enterprise. So, in fact, as an example of collaboration, interestingly, much as we might criticize them, the nature of the engagement between NPHET and government did become a collaborative enterprise. There was an initial phase where, in fact, and it's been alluded to already, government was in formation. We had essentially a caretaker government, awaiting the formation of a new government, which took an incredibly long period of time. Oddly, that's almost a technocratic situation where ministers hold office. They don't have a sense of accountability to the people or the parliament in the same way, and they will make decisions on the basis of expert advice. As soon as you have a government, all sorts of other considerations come into play. They now genuinely feel directly accountable to the people. They're representing people's view insofar as they can. And the whole dynamic becomes a lot different. And it's not the unquestioning receipt of expert advice. It's, what is it you're telling me? And how can I make this meaningful for the population? It doesn't make sense. It's not going to work for this group that I represent or that group that I represent. So there's a dynamic change and a necessity for collaboration, and it's necessary to properly advise government and people to be open about the uncertainties, to be open about the diversity of views. And by the way, I'm not here to defend a position. If I look back on 2 years plus at this, there's plenty of mistakes, there's plenty of opportunities for learning, plenty of things misunderstood, plenty of things got wrong. I'd be happy to enumerate them, but actually 20 minutes isn't enough time. There were plenty of things got right as well, plenty of advantages that our society had. Just as a couple of examples, like we have a strong state. We have a strong public service, very highly trained, very committed. We have a very learned population, and a population that's interested in learning and when invited to play the game, as Roland put it, interested in playing, but interested in playing an 11 playing field. And we don't have an illusion of control that some larger countries have. There are larger post-imperial states who fancy that they could negotiate with or even win against or beat the virus. It wasn't in the Irish mind to say, let's beat this thing. It was in the Irish mind to say, let's survive this thing as best we can, and that's a different posture. So if I can kind of draw towards a conclusion by saying 3 things, I think we should invite a collaborative engagement between science, and when science is genuinely reflective, it's comfortable in its own uncertainty. It's comfortable in not being powerful, but in being collaborative. When put on the spot, I guess people felt that they had to synthesize and offer advice. And you're in something of a quandary as a medical professional where society invests a certain level of responsibility and trust and won't accept a situation that says, well, I didn't know what to do, so I did nothing. So there's an ethical quandary there. So in drawing towards a conclusion, I would invite a collaborative discussion that's interdisciplinary. Because one of the things that really opened up science to its best possibilities was twofold. One, in order to mount a response to this, we were required to be interdisciplinary. And that only accentuates the uncertainty within your own disciplinary base. You have to come to the table with people who are really good at what they do and uncertain in it, and begin to pool your uncertainty and pool your humility, quite frankly, and say, I understand what I do, but I don't really understand what you do. And we need to come to a common understanding before we can hope to offer some kind of holistic or comprehensive advice. So interdisciplinarity is critical. And the second thing that was critical was engagement. There was simply no point, and this was utterly imperfectly done, let me say that, but I'm relaying an experience. When we had the opportunity to engage with people who are subject matter experts, who were engaged on the ground with resolving the problem, and I'll come to a particular cadre of people in a minute, it utterly changed our scientific thinking and practice, to say, well, we think about it this way, but you experience the problem in a different way. So when we had the opportunity to think through possible solutions together in an interdisciplinary manner with communities, and this is no great insight, everybody knows this, but I do have to relate, everybody knows it, but we don't practice it anywhere near enough. Then we found much richer experiences, much more lasting experience, and building then relationships of trust where when it's all over, it's possible to learn and it's possible to heal the trauma. And the group of people that I want to allude to in particular then is the discipline of public health. If there was a weakness that this whole pandemic exposed, it exposed two big things. One, structural inequalities in our society really matter. That's been alluded to by others. And governments constantly struggle to address them. That's why they persist. They address them ineffectively. The discipline of public health is a discipline which really endeavors to address that kind of tension between the individual experience of the intersection between health and our position in society and the collective experience as a population. So I think I really take Orla's point about this is a collective action issue, but at the same time situating the individual within that collective action is critically important. So for a public health professional, you're dealing with the individual in the community, in the population, and you're largely dealing with it from trying to balance those different perspectives. And actually our experience of the intrusion, so to speak, of public health and how we order our society or our liberties, so to speak, is actually quite limited. The smoking ban is a very good example. I remember sitting in a bar in France with a friend where there was signs up protesting against the smoking ban. It was a classic situation where on expert advice, governments collaboratively legislate to change the way we behave. And my friend turned and looked at the protest sign and went, yes, liberté, égalité, fume. So we do have a developed system and profession for resolving these issues. And the core weakness that the pandemic exposed was the systematic underinvestment and marginalization of the discipline of public health. So that when the time came, there wasn't sufficient capacity. We had huge amounts of expert scientific advice. We mobilized the scientific advice very well and on a strong interdisciplinary basis within science. We didn't find the space or time to properly and effectively mobilize the contribution of the social sciences to that. There was a contribution, but it wasn't as integrated as I would like to see it if we had to do this again. But when it came to actually then engaging with people on the ground to say, how are we going to make advice work? How are we going to collaboratively construct solutions? There simply weren't enough people given enough status within society, in public health. So a lot of stuff didn't happen or didn't happen effectively because of a lack of capacity to shape and refine a solution. So to conclude then, I think there are two big lessons that I'd like to see us approach. One is the institutionalization of how, for the betterment of public health, society, government, and expert contribution is mobilized through, in my view, I simply think we should have a separate National Institute of Public Health that sets aside from the system and drives change to the advantage of the population through the system. And so I think we could mobilize our expertise in a much more interdisciplinary, engaged, real way at scale. And the other thing is to invite a real conversation. This is one, but I think it's a systematic study over a period of years that's genuinely interdisciplinary across the sciences, social sciences, and humanities to say, what really happened? How did we really experience it? Because history's been rewritten, for instance, as we speak. What really happened? How did we really experience it? And what would we really like to do in order to prepare, not just for this? And then my final comment, we must learn lessons from this that apply to the climate and biodiversity crisis. They're different in terms of the immediacy of the threat in our minds, but they're utterly analogous in terms of the way we have to act as individuals within a collective to respond to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was I know for many of us, it's wonderful to have an opportunity for you to speak in that way and share so much in a obviously very sophisticated way in terms of how you've reflected back on that. And again, I'm really looking forward to the Q&A part. Maybe it says more about me than, well, no, it doesn't. It says a lot about Ireland as well. I spent the first 9 months of the pandemic in New York City, holed up in a 1-bedroom apartment with my 2 kids and my husband. And I have to say, coming back to Ireland and New York was on the American setting, a great example of responses, I think, in general. But, you know, and going back, Orla, to your point in terms of the scale, it just felt so much more cohesive here coming home and that the difference of the scale and how we look back on our history, to David's point in terms of, to Philip's point in terms of the posture we took as a society, I think probably reverberating back to our own history, which brings me very nicely to our third speaker. David McCullagh is a co-presenter of the 6-1 News on RTE. Before that, he co-presented Primetime for 7 years and was political correspondent for 12 years. He has a PhD in politics from UCD and has written 5 books, including a 2-volume biography of Eamon de Valera, Rise and Rule, and most recently the Great Politics book, A Guide to Politics for Children and for Some Adults. David today is going to speak. His title is Telling the Story of the Pandemic in Ireland. I have a feed. Oh, you're going to come up? Okay, I thought you'd stay there. Thank you. Welcome to David McCullagh. Hi, David. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thanks. I thought I'd come up to the podium because I don't have anything very profound to say, so I was going to try and disguise it by standing up here. The good news is it's nearly lunchtime. The bad news is you're going to have to listen to me first, so I apologise for that. First off, I can't claim to be speaking for RT. I can't claim to be speaking for the media in general. I certainly can't claim to be speaking for journalists in general. All I can do is talk about my own personal experience of covering COVID. And as Miriam says, when the pandemic started, I was co-presenting Primetime. For those unfamiliar, it's a current affairs programme, goes out on Tuesdays and Thursdays on RT television. I was also co-presenting This Week on radio on Sundays in September 2020. So after the first kind of wave, I suppose, of COVID, I moved across to the 6-1 News. And across those programmes, across all media output for that matter, COVID was the constant of those times, sometimes all-consuming, seemingly inescapable. And early on, one of our colleagues made the point that this very possibly could be the biggest story we would ever cover. And that is a big claim to make. I've covered the Troubles, the peace process, elections, the financial crash, the climate crisis, various wars, from a safe distance in the case of the wars. But COVID had such an impact on so many people right across the world in terms of health, obviously, in terms of the economic effects of the lockdowns, in terms of the speed of vaccine development. And that, coupled with the fact that it went on so long, certainly made it one of the most consequential stories I've been involved in covering. I was looking back at notes from those early days, and the things that strike me most is the uncertainty that we all faced, the sense that we really didn't know where this was going and what it was all going to mean. And I think the harsh reality of what we were facing at the end of Act 1, I suppose, as Ida would put it, only really got through to me during a prime time on the 19th of March when I was interviewing Catherine Motherway, who was at that time an intensive care specialist at University Hospital Limerick. And we'd all been watching those shocking images from Bergamo in Lombardy, where hospitals were overwhelmed by the number of cases, the morgues were full, and the army trucks were carting away bodies. It was absolutely horrific. And we were thought to be a couple of weeks behind Italy in terms of where the cases were going. So I asked Dr. Motherway how our health system compared in terms of intensive care beds, for instance. And she didn't put a tooth in it. We had half the intensive care beds per head that Italy had. And in any case, she said no health service could cope with what Italy was experiencing. And she stressed that people needed not to get the disease, needed not to end up in ICU, needed not to require a ventilator. And the only way to do that in those pre-vaccine days was to stay away from each other. And she said it very well. We must treat each other like pariahs. We need to do that to prevent what happened in Italy from happening here. Now, that frightened the living daylights out of me. And it did the same to plenty of others. That video very quickly racked up 1 million views online. So just in case we didn't know we were in deep trouble, we certainly did after hearing that. I think for journalists, particularly broadcasters, there were two broad categories of challenge in covering the pandemic, logistical and editorial. In terms of logistics, we had the same problems as every other workplace, plus a few specific to us. For instance, our terrible lockdown haircuts were on full view for the public. And like everyone else, the key thing early on was to get everyone who could work from home out of the office. And thanks to modern tech, that worked surprisingly well. Video editors working remotely, cutting packages, a reporter would send a voice track, pictures, interviews, all that sort of stuff. And they'd work collaboratively over WhatsApp or email or over the phone to try and put the whole thing together. On radio programs, could be broadcast from home, particularly difficult if you had two presenters, each in a different location, a program editor and a sound op at base, and perhaps interviewees in other locations again. It wasn't easy, but it did work most of the time. I did a couple of This Week programs that way. I didn't particularly like it because I find in radio presentation, a lot of it is the eye contact with the program editor behind the glass panel in the control room, and the various hand signals one uses, most of which aren't repeatable and now in the days of webcams have to be reduced. But at least it kept us on air when otherwise we might not have been able to broadcast. Claire Byrne, many of you will have seen after catching COVID, did her TV program a couple of times from her garden shed, which she did very well. Thankfully, it didn't come to that for me, although there were changes in the early stages on primetime. We split the two programs. Miriam did Tuesday and I did Thursday, I think. And then the same with the program team. A different editor would do each day, different team of producers and reporters. So obviously people could work remotely, but in terms of actually being physically in the office, we've split into two teams so that if one team went down, the other would be able to carry on. When I moved across to the 6-1 in that September, things had eased up a bit and we were allowed to have two presenters in studio. I'm sure anybody watching wouldn't have noticed, but we had to be socially distanced. So we had to be 2 meters apart for whatever difference that might make. Probably didn't make any difference to people at home, didn't make any difference particularly to me, but it made a huge difference just on a practical level for the guys who do the lighting and the camera angles and all that sort of stuff. They all had to be changed to take account of that. We weren't allowed to have people in for interview on our fabulous sofa. We had to do it either by sending a camera crew who would obviously have to set up outside rather than going into somebody's home or office, or we could do it on Zoom. And Zoom was one of the revelations of the whole thing, and it made life an awful lot easier because suddenly everybody in the world knew how to do video conferencing. So we could interview anybody in the world without having to get a camera crew to them for a start or to get a satellite link. And audiences were used to seeing people on apps like that, so we were able to get away with it. And Zoom helped in other ways. I'm now able to dial into our morning news conference while I'm walking my dog. So same as everybody else, I suppose, in the world. But of course, like every other job in the world, the lack of face-to-face interaction had lots of downsides. That water cooler chat that gives you an idea, colleague having a phone number that you're looking for, that they hear you're looking for and can give you, all that kind of cross-fertilization was suddenly much more difficult and took much more time. But we managed to get through it, although it did get very hairy at certain points due to people being off sick, particularly if the illness was concentrated in a particular job. For instance, I think news directors were very badly hit at one stage, which nearly took us off air. But lots of colleagues, as in many other lines of work, were really brilliant at plugging gaps, taking on extra responsibility to keep the show on the road, because all of us knew that this was important, that we were meeting a need. We had emergency plans in place if things got really bad, a backup newsroom in case we had to abandon the main one, for instance, or severe cuts to output to prioritise the main bulletins. And some programmes were taken off air, including our children's news programme, News Today, during the first lockdown, because the staff were desperately needed to keep the main bulletins, the 6, 1 and the 9 and so on air. And it was a real shame because it was at a time when kids were at home because the schools were closed. They needed information more than they ever did before, and information they could trust. But they did do a couple of initiatives, like they did interviews with the CMO at the time. They did interviews with the Minister for Health and put kids' questions to them in terms of that they would understand. And that was able to provide a service to our younger viewers. And the programme stayed on air, thankfully, to subsequent lockdowns. Logistics then were a big problem, but with a lot of effort by a lot of people, we coped, touch and go as it was at times. Now, of course, providing news is nowhere near as important as the health service, the other emergency services, funeral directors, or retail, or a whole lot of other things that were kept open during the pandemic. But overcoming the logistical challenges was important for our viewers because they needed reliable news and current affairs more than ever. Now, perhaps more important than logistical challenges were the editorial difficulties facing us in an unprecedented national emergency. Now, I take the point that obviously we've had pandemics before, but not in living memory, and not at a time when we had a national broadcaster, of course. Our editorial principles require us to be trustworthy, accurate, and impartial. Trust is described in our editorial guidelines as the cornerstone of RTE. Our content should be honest, reliable, authoritative, accurate, impartial, fair, and independent of vested interest. Tall order. It is drilled into everyone that RTE is there to serve the public, that the public must be able to have confidence that what RTE broadcasts has integrity and that we are editorially independent of government and of business interests, political parties, trade unions, and pressure groups. I was struck by something I read written by Tony Hall, who is a former Director General of the BBC, and he said that more than ever, in a time when there's lots of disinformation and misinformation around, everyone has a fundamental right to information on which they can base their lives, information and news that they know they can trust. And that is true of RTE, and it was particularly true of what was happening during the pandemic. I appreciate that RTE is held to higher standards than some other media, and I believe it's right. RTE is owned, is funded, is for the people of this country. And I think we're all conscious of those standards and we try to live up to them. So how did we do during the pandemic? Philip was saying there were lots of mistakes made. I can put my hand on my heart and say the media and RTE and I made lots of mistakes over the course of the pandemic in terms of what we covered, what we didn't. I think the main criticism of COVID coverage in the media and on RTE was twofold. One, there was too much of it, and two, that it was too uncritical of the line from government. I'm not sure about the first. Given how big a story it was, how long it lasted, how it affected every aspect of human existence, it was bound to get rather a lot of media attention, added to which, with most of the country and most of the world closed, in effect, there wasn't an awful lot of other news going on. Obviously, it's very much in the eye of the beholder. Some people here will probably disagree with me. Some people genuinely felt our coverage was responsible for scaring people unnecessarily. But in defence of the media, we were relaying a consistent message from public health experts. That word again, experts. One criticism I think is justified is that for a long time we reported daily case numbers without giving the proper context, thanks in part to delays caused by the restrictions on people being in the office. It took ages to come up with a way to put daily figures into graph form showing which direction case numbers were going over the course of a few months, which was the important information for people. Is this getting worse at the moment or is it getting better? And obviously people would base their actions on that information, but we did get it in the end. The really important metric, of course, was hospitalizations and particularly ICU admissions, which gave an indication of how close the hospital system was to being swamped, which was the whole point of lockdowns, to avoid that. And we did give those figures every day, although perhaps some people might have preferred more emphasis on them rather than just on case numbers. What about the other criticism that we were too uncritical of the government line? It's certainly something we were all aware of. I don't entirely subscribe to the view that a journalist's relationship to a politician should be that of a dog to a lamppost. Not entirely, anyway. But I do think it's bad for everyone, especially the viewers, if the media and government are too cosy. Politics is about making choices, and it's important that those choices are probed and challenged to try to see if they make sense. I don't think journalists should be cynical, but they do need to be skeptical and to ask awkward questions. Does that change during an emergency situation where decisions can literally be a matter of life and death, potentially for thousands of people? Should the media suspend criticism in the wider interests of society? I think the answer to that is no. I think we did have a responsibility to offer people as much information as possible, as much reliable scientific advice as possible, so they could be equipped to navigate their way through the crisis, but always to keep asking those questions. I was looking back at some of those primetime programs we did very early on, and I was struck by how many of the issues we were discussing then were still being discussed for months afterwards. Whether we should all be wearing masks, for instance, which was mentioned earlier, issues about the lack of PPE in hospitals and nursing homes, problems with testing, support for nursing homes. We were debating the effectiveness and the consequences of lockdowns even before they were introduced. I think everyone understood that there were trade-offs involved in lockdowns. There were legitimate arguments to be had around whether controls had to be tightened to stop the spread of the virus or loosened to prevent economic collapse, or all the other adverse effects on children's education, for instance, or on non-COVID healthcare. It was important to hear those points of view, and I think they were heard. For many people, the most memorable broadcasts of the entire pandemic were the addresses by the Taoiseach of the day from the steps of government buildings, which were carried live on the 6-1 News and indeed by our colleagues in Virgin Media. These broadcasts, certainly the early ones, were massively important for the public, as was shown by the viewing figures, because they let people know how they would be living their lives for the next weeks or months. And I think it was entirely legitimate to carry them. But by their nature, they didn't allow for questions or for challenge. That would come later at news conferences, and the HSE and NEFIT briefings were carried live on our news channel, so people could hear that questioning for themselves if they sought it out. But we were also conscious of the need for some kind of balance on our main bulletin, the 6-1, so we offered the leader of the main opposition party a chance to respond to whatever had been announced. The problem being that, by and large, the opposition were in no more of a position to challenge the expert advice than were the government, or as indeed were the media. As I say, the addresses from government buildings were truly very important at the beginning. They might have become a bit overdone towards the end, when some would argue the announcement could have been made in the Dáil instead. Although I remember John Bruton saying one time, the best way to keep a secret in this country is to make a speech about it in the Dáil. Of course, our government did have the great advantage of being compared a lot of the time to what was going on in the neighbouring jurisdiction. And the utter dysfunction in Downing Street couldn't help but make any government here look relatively competent. However, the UK did at one point get ahead of us with the vaccine rollout, which led to some searching examination of what our own experts were up to. But the fact that we quite quickly caught up with Britain when it came to boosters rather dampened that particular topic. But rather than being too deferential to the government, were we perhaps too deferential to NEFIT? I'm sure members of NEFIT doing media interviews and those daily news conferences felt they were being asked the questions, and the fact that they did that, and the fact that there were questions raised, at least meant that they had to take potential criticisms into account, and they knew that they'd have to defend their positions in public. And I certainly think the more scrutiny there is, the better are the decisions that are likely to be made. There was, of course, another line of criticism from the far reaches of the anti-vax movement. Roland referred to them with considerably more charity than I can probably muster myself. They used to turn up at the gates of RTE to claim that RTE was the virus, that we were all in the pay of Bill Gates, sadly not, that we were lying about deaths, and so on and so forth. Some of them even claimed to believe that we were extracting a chemical, adrenochrome, from children, which helped RTE presenters to maintain their youthful good looks. As you can see, I either didn't get my share or it doesn't work on me. I'm not sure that people actually believed any of this nonsense, which all comes from the QAnon lunacy in the States. It's more a kind of an identifier, I think, for the group. But there was method in the madness of making those claims about RTE. If you're trying, for whatever reason, to undermine a collective effort to control COVID, you have to undermine trust in the media, and especially in the main source of news for most people. And people were watching. The pandemic led to a huge increase in audiences. Between March and May 2020, the 6-1 was up 85% on the previous year. The 9 was up 91%. On January 5th, 2021, as the government was considering closing schools for another month, the 6-1 had an audience of just under 800,000, which is huge for any news programme in this country. Those figures trailed off. Naturally, that extra audience is gone now, but it shows that when there's a crisis, people turn to the media, they turn to RTE for the information they need because of the trust that has been mentioned so much and that I spoke about earlier. Which brings me, I'm afraid, to my own worst moment of the entire pandemic, when I very stupidly took my mask off for a photo with a retiring RTE staff member, which was subsequently published in the newspapers. I apologised at the time for my misjudgment, and I have no problem in doing so again. And the reason the apology was necessary, and the reason I genuinely felt and feel terrible about it, was that it threatened the audience's trust in us as an organisation, and if I can be egotistical for a moment, in myself as a journalist. Thankfully, most people seem to accept that I was stupid rather than anything else, but it was a reminder that there is a responsibility on those of us working for the national broadcaster to live up to the highest standards. So what have we in the media learned from this huge, multifaceted, sometimes frightening, sometimes inspiring story? First, that we have a duty to live up to the public's trust by providing them with as much accurate information as we can. Second, that while unnecessary carping in the middle of an emergency isn't particularly helpful, we do need to keep questioning government and experts, keep asking for the rationale for decisions, keep holding people to account. Third, that even in the most challenging of circumstances, people can and will do amazing things to keep the show on the road in the interest of the most important people of all, which is our viewers. And I sincerely hope these are lessons that are learned but are never need to be used in another pandemic. But I think if nothing else, COVID has reminded us of some fundamentals of what it is that we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Again, a wonderful insight into your journey through it all. And again, I'm looking forward to opportunities for more questions. So we've lots of time for Q&A. And I believe we'll have mics roaming there for the benefit of capturing the recording for those watching back later or live. I don't know whether we're going out live at the moment. Does anyone want to kick off there? The gentleman here in the blue. Maybe say who you are, if you don't mind. Sure,
Adam Kelly from University College Dublin. Thank you all very much. That was really, really interesting. My question is really mostly for David. One of the things that we learned, to go back to what Philip was saying about what we learned during the pandemic, I think was the need for excess capacity in hospitals to deal with these kinds of issues, or at least that was the conversation a lot of the time. But I wondered whether you thought that was necessary in journalism as well, based on what you were saying about the need, where resources went, because you were very humble to say that, hospitals, schools, everybody else is doing more important work. But it strikes me that media work in the pandemic was absolutely crucial, for getting the message out. I mean, there's no point in having, hospitals functioning relatively well if people don't know there's a pandemic happening, or at least don't know what advice to take. And I feel lucky that we do have public sector broadcasting in this country, and we had a coherent message going out. But how much does the kind of financial stress on RTE, generally speaking, did you feel any of that, or how much do you feel that there's a case to be made for sort of excess capacity for the likes of RTE and public sector media generally?
In the unlikely event that any of my bosses are watching, yes, absolutely, we should have an increase in the licence fee. That's obviously the lesson. Look, all media outlets in this country are under severe pressure. The newspapers are fighting a valiant battle against against the passage of time. Nobody seems to have ever made the internet pay. And, RTE has its own problems. TV3 have their own problems, and the independent radio stations, and I think, in fairness, I think all of those media outlets played a part in getting a message across. I can't claim that RTE was unique in that. We do, at the moment anyway, have larger audiences, so therefore you could ascribe a certain importance to that. I think what I was saying about the viewing figures, it was the same during the financial crash when the IMF roared into town. I'm sure we all remember that. In a time of crisis, people want information that they can rely on. They want information that they can trust, and they turn to respected, trusted brands in the media, not just RTE, but some of the newspapers, some of the other broadcasters as well. And I think it's really important for society that we have that resource there. And thank you for saying it. And what implications that has in terms of government funding, in terms of the license fee and everything is above my pay grade, thankfully. But I'll just say that I think, we faced a really challenging time. Even still, like, people are all knackered in RTE, like everybody's just worn out. And so I'm sure it's the same in many other walks of life. But if I can be permitted to take a certain amount of pride in what we did, because I think against pretty serious odds, and I'm not in any way equating it with anything like the health service or retail or any of the other really, really fundamental things in society. But I think information that you could trust was important and will continue to be important, I hope. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Peter Nolan. I'm a postgraduate student at National College of Ireland part-time, but I'd just like to make a quick observation maybe about the media. One thing which I think was surprising to me, I was living in Stockholm during most of the pandemic, and I thought it was very interesting among my, I knew many other expatriates as friends there. The Swedes were behaving in a fairly relaxed way, but you could notice the differences by different national groups. I knew many Italians who would not leave their apartments for days at a time. They were obviously, I think, looking at and trying to follow the Italian practice. I was very strict compared to the Swedes as well. So I think the media is extremely important, and the kind of culture, that inquiry that comes with that, I think, was extremely important. But I think there was one thing I noticed. I'd like to address this question to you and to Professor Nolan as well. Is obviously there was a lot of an effort put together in public health, and particularly on the modelling, which was extremely important. But I never came across any source in the Irish media which was really examining the models, the methodology, critiquing them, understanding them, which seemed a very big kind of gap. Like I work in risk management and finance. It's a different domain, but still the kind of bread and butter of what I was doing. And there was a very big disagreement in Sweden. There seemed to be quite a relaxed attitude on the part of the government and the bodies involved in that there. That was quite famous. I think their chief of public health was quite vocal about that. Whereas the NGOs and people working in the private business private sector and academia were much more panicked about it, frankly. They were much more concerned and were much quicker to take action. So the question would be really, do you feel that the Irish media is really bridging the gap between the experts and the public? And if so, what could they do to improve that?
Thanks very much. I thought part of that was that the Swedes tend to be quite compliant anyway, so the advice was followed without the necessity for the heavy hand, and certainly the Swedish example was talked about a lot in the media at the time, because they seem to be doing things differently, and perhaps I think you're probably right to say that we didn't give Philip here a hard enough time. Looking back on it, I mean, I think we had encounters, and Philip had encounters with many other journalists over the time, and there were questions being asked. But part of the problem, I think, and I'm probably stealing Philip's answer, is part of the problem is the model is a prediction of what will happen if you don't do anything, and then you do something, and the thing doesn't happen. So therefore, the modelling must be wrong. So I think that was part of the criticism. But whether we should have interrogated more, as I was saying earlier, I think there's certainly an argument that perhaps there should have been more interrogation right across the media of aspects of that, like is the modelling realistic and has it been borne out by events? But perhaps I'll hand over to Philip there.
Yeah. I did have an encounter with David actually, where like just before they're going 10 seconds, and just before they go 3, 2, 1, he asked me this really nasty question, and my mind went blank. So you gave me a hard enough time. But no. The truth is, when it comes to, I think in terms of the public health response, I think it was subject to a great deal of appropriate media scrutiny, both in terms of the conferences, and then, the politicians were responsible for making the decisions, and they did get pretty robust questioning. And so the problem with some technical aspects of it is it's not really amenable to detailed back and forth questioning in the format of a standard media package. First of all, it's technically difficult to scrutinize. And secondly, it's technically difficult to scrutinize in a standard format. That said, one of the things that three things that I might say. First of all, our first response was to try and get other people's models and implement them. So we asked colleagues internationally, say, just send us your code. And actually the response was, well, we won't, because our code is so complex, so messy, so poorly documented. It's been a scientific project we've been doing for a decade. It's just not going to be useful to you. And that some of those criticisms of those models came out later, that they were too complicated, actually, to use effectively. So we were in the unusual position of having to build one from scratch. And because it was simpler, it was, in one sense, more useful because it was easier to scrutinize, and less useful because if you asked a very detailed question, like if we open primary schools but keep secondary schools closed, what will happen? And you're going, that's a 4-year project to build a model like that. And the second thing I was impressed by was the level of questioning that the political system, it's important we don't underestimate the intelligence of our political representatives. Like, they have a very difficult task to kind of bring everybody along, but when you put them in a room and say, this is complex technical detail, my God, can they absorb it? And I would have had phone calls from cabinet ministers before going on your shows saying, can we just talk through this one more time? Because I really need to understand it. And then there were, I have to call out your colleague, Mark Coughlin, who's an outstanding kind of technical journalist, if I can put it that way. And he would have spent a great deal of time not only looking at how the models worked, but critiquing them and saying, but I've read this and that doesn't, so there was, and he would have then presented nice packages on the show, 4 or 5 minutes long, to say, I've looked at this and this is how it works. And then finally, the models we used were peer reviewed so the scrutiny did come from peers internationally, but late in the day, I have to say, because it takes a long time to go through that process.
Thank you.
So I was impressed by the number of David's colleagues who are capable of getting into the detail and scrutinizing it.
Thank you, Philip. Sinead, there's somebody down there beside you who's had her hand up there. Okay. Yeah, and then Mary Canning and Dan and Luke. Okay. You go first, Mary. Yeah,
right. Thanks.
So I don't want to miss that other person yet.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you. An awful lot to think about this morning. I have a specific question, probably for Orla, though Philip may want to comment as well. So we haven't talked about the impact much on the education system. And I wondered, are you planning or are you thinking about, particularly we're hearing anecdotal evidence of what has happened to school children and the loss that they incurred right through the pandemic. Those who lived in better houses with a room and a laptop and a connection and a school that was going online with their lessons. So there are equitable issues, access issues. And if Philip wants to comment, he may not thank me for this question, the decision on keeping the schools closed later. So there's two aspects to this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we do have, and we are involved in an international study that looks particularly at that. And I think where we differed to very many other places was our schools stayed closed for longer. And we had no system for a particular group of children who we would say were at risk. So there is the issue of, we will speak to you. And I think that became apparent very quickly. We'll do Zoom classes, and there might be 5 children in a house and 1 computer. Even in my family home, I would consider a relatively affluent home. The Wi-Fi couldn't cope with all of this, school from home, teaching from home, engaging with supervision from home, all this kind of stuff. But I think there is a very specific group of at-risk children whose only, I suppose, connection and safety was at school, and who were very high risk at home. And that group of children appear to really have been quite damaged. So there was 2 threats at operating during the pandemic. One was the threat of the virus itself, and the other one was what the lockdown brought. And for people in abusive or high risk homes, that really is something that. So we are, yes, the answer is yes, we are doing work. It does seem to have consequence for academic performance. It seems to have a big consequence for mental health. We're seeing consequence in terms of physiological indicators of health. But that, I think, is going to be a longer term project.
It's funny. I almost shared your microphone and then pulled back. It's funny how those old human things we used to do as signs of bonding, we stopped doing. So we think we know more than we do. So one of the things that we think we know how this virus spreads, and actually we don't. I mean, there's been a human challenge study published in the last couple of weeks, which is asking us to look again at hands and surfaces. So there's a period of time when, we know how it spreads. Actually, we don't. So there's a lot of actually quite poor and sloppy science out there over the last 2 years that's giving us a false sense that we know it's going to be years more before we get a handle on how SARS-CoV-2 and influenza really spread and what are the differences between them. And I think it's kind of accepted wisdom that schools and universities are major sources of influenza spread. And the early data suggested that SARS-CoV-2 might be different and they might not be major sources of spread. All that by way of summary, back to Eudicem difficile, in imperfect information, I think our judgment at the time was that the priority should be the reopening of schools and universities, that other things, workplaces, hospitality, that we could forego our time in the pub in favour. And this is the big thing. Different environments carry different risks, but one of the big determinants is the overall level of social contact and social mixing, as you will have heard me say over and over again for 2 years. I'm tired saying it. So I do think, even not only with the benefit of hindsight, even in foresight, there was a lot of pressure from the public health side to get schools back open earlier, and a lot of reluctance to close. I remember the big closure was kind of the 2 big closures are panics. And I'm not saying inappropriate panics. We were under threat, so we did what immediately comes to mind, the March 2020 closure and the January 2021 closure. They were done under enormous stress, almost duress. There was even reluctance to do it at that time. And I do remember the phrase being saying, if they're closed now, you'll never get them open, quote unquote. So there was a real reluctance to close them and a real pressure to open them earlier. But then you're intersecting with a whole kind of political and social complexity about, do teachers feel safe? Do families feel safe? Particularly when they've been through, just remember how traumatic January 2021 was. Everybody felt much more threatened and much less safe after that. So to cut a long story short, I think school closures could have been much shorter. And that's one of the things that we think about in future preparedness. How do we mount more nuanced responses than the response we had? Yeah, that's about probably more than I should say about it.
Thank you, Philip. So we'll go down. So we have this person here, and then Dan and Luke, and then I've two at the back here, and I think that'll bring us up to lunchtime. So work away.
Hello, my name is Catherine Gallagher, and I'm a PhD researcher in DCU. I'm researching the media and, to a certain extent, political communication in Ireland to the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm naturally listening and learning with great interest today. And I have two quick questions, and hopefully I'm not causing too much repetition today, but I'm naturally curious. The first question being, there's some members of NEFIT and other experts in Ireland have made brief public comments